The demon on the fire-blazing porch. He appeared again that year, just as he had for the past 5 years, causing most trick-or-treaters to huddle behind the invisible line of unease extending to the curb, with his fiery red smile and bubbling cauldrons. It was a scene out of Faust, but this was no play. This was my neighborhood. Not just the children, but even the parents hesitated anxiously outside, in a place where Halloween was defined by little more than cardboard skeletons and plastic jack-o'-lanterns. A fire-obsessed man with a pitchfork was truly terrifying. Younger children were often urged across the street, with the hope that they would be distracted by candy long enough to spare them psychologically damaging nightmares from even the briefest glimpse in his direction. Only a few, the bravest, dared step forward and take candy from the hands of the devil sitting exposed beneath the red glow of the threshold. Trick-or-treating in the 1970s wasn't the dance with death it is today. Back then, in most suburban areas, people had lived in the same house for years and made an effort to know their neighbors and their children. It was a safe haven, away from the cruel world outside, a fortress of pure thoughts and refined ideals, which is why it was all the more alarming when occasionally unsavory types, like the Warren family, infiltrated this peaceful society and upset the balance of neatly trimmed lawns and Tupperware parties. Especially when on Halloween night, their eldest son, Wayne Warren, painted himself red, donned devil horns, and sat on a throne between 2 cauldrons of fire blazing on their sunken porch. My first encounter with him was when my father volunteered to retrieve my coveted candy bar from the devil's hand. I watched wide-eyed from the curb as my mother gossiped with the neighboring moms about the depraved nature of the whole thing. That night, when I spilled my spoils across the living room floor, she snatched the peanut-studded Snickers from the devil's hand and tossed it in the garbage. I didn't understand the gesture until much later, though to my knowledge, no one had ever reported any ill effects from his candy. The face-painting demon quickly became a rite of passage for the youth of our neighborhood. As we grew older, our worth was measured by whether we dared retrieve candy from his house on our own. For most neighborhood kids, it was a confrontation with their own childhood fears, a coming-of-age ritual. But my own encounter with him was more than just a conflict with superstition. For me, it wasn't a conquest, but a beginning, a gateway into an obsession that reached far beyond October rituals. And after what had indirectly caused to happen to my life and that of my best friend Dan Rutgers, I realized I had more in common with Wayne Warren than anyone ever knew. I had grown old enough to trick or treat on my own. It had been a few years since my middle school years, but I still chose to bypass the devil's house, despite my humane freedom. And as the shivering candy collector stood cowering at the edge of his lawn that night, I stared, ready to cast off my silly childish fears. In the recessed brownstone porch, the devil sat on a black throne, wielding a pitchfork and grinning madly. On either side of him, cauldrons spouted flames, illuminating the entire alcove in a pink-red glow, bringing a small piece of hell to our suburban street. Dark music, perhaps borrowed from the Omen soundtrack, poured from somewhere on the porch like the theme to a black mass, while the sounds of the haunted house quietly seeped from the house's dark windows. They were open just enough to let in some of the unusually cool autumn air for Texas, even in late October. Occasionally, the devil would shout something like, "Come on up, kids," or simply let out a spine-tingling laugh that echoed through the houses, then dissipated into the night air like a dispersing pack of ghosts. As a fan of classic horror films, deep down, I was beginning to admire his mastery of the Halloween holiday, but the fear of something I didn't yet fully comprehend overshadowed this association. The person behind that red face was real, and that's what scared me, even if everyone else just dismissed him as an arrogant jerk. "Are we going up there?" Dan asked me, as I stood at the curb, my final shreds of courage ebbing away. Dan was a few years older than me, and several inches taller, but we were cut from the same mold. We had been best friends for 6 years, sharing a passion for Hot Wheels, big gyms, and superheroes. I could see his own hesitation lurking beneath the green skin of his Hulk face. His mother was a rabid Baptist, and although I couldn't fully comprehend it then, he was grappling with far deeper issues than I was in the presence of the demonic display. "Yeah," I replied, though I had yet to top off my courage tank. Our mutual friend Bob spoke from behind his Planet of the Apes mask. "You guys go on if you want, but I'm not. My brother said that guy's a psycho, and he doesn't want to have to kick his ass when he finds a razor blade in my candy." "I'm not planning on eating the candy," I replied, stating what I believed was obvious. The music switched to a new melody, and I stared intently at the real flames, the overaged teenager in the red makeup, and the wrought iron gates that were propped open in the vaulted entryway. "Look, he's not going to kill us or anything. He's been doing this since I can remember, and a lot of kids have gone up there." I nodded toward 2 older kids who had just taken candy from the devil's hand. "They just did. If they can do it, so can I. Dan, you coming?" With an affirmation from Dan, I stepped onto the devil's brown lawn and started forward. I tried to visualize what I saw across the street the other 364 days of the year. A cold-faced stone house with a dark porch and a gaunt junkie stepping in and out of his old Camaro, occasionally kissing or hitting his girlfriend, but always giving me a chin-up nod as if to say I was cool. It was just Wayne Warren, not the devil. Telling myself this made it a little better, but on Halloween night this guy was different, truly frightening. And as I got closer, I tried my usual nod hello, but Wayne didn't nod back. Instead, he grinned like an asylum patient and let out a cackle that echoed in the sunken porch as if it had plunged straight to hell. Dan, as if to demonstrate proper Halloween etiquette, stepped up beside me, held out his bag, and mumbled "trick or treat" in a way that sounded utterly absurd under the circumstances. "Hey, hey." Wayne giggled and tossed a chunky into his bag. Then he focused on me and my spirit gum werewolf face. "Got something special for you, my friend," he said, reaching down beside his seat. He retrieved something, stared at it for a moment, then tossed it into the bag I held out before me as if it was my empty soul waiting for him to fill. I didn't get a good look at it, but I didn't care. I would examine it more closely as soon as Dan and I made it off the lawn. Without further explanation, Wayne lit a cauldron, spat, then turned his attention to a group of teenagers approaching. Dan and I scurried back to the curb where Bob was waiting. "Let's go next door and see what he gave me," I said. Crouching under the streetlight, Dan and I pulled out our devil spoils. "Just a regular candy bar, but I wonder if there's a razor blade inside," he said, unwrapping the chunky and breaking it into pieces, finding nothing but chocolate inside. Bob removed his Cornelius mask. "What did you get?" I pulled out the strange item Wayne had tossed into my bag and held it up under the stark white beam of the streetlight. "Looks like a tooth or a horn," I said, having never seen anything like it before. It was about 3 inches long, jagged at one end, and tapering to a curved point at the other. But instead of being made of bone or enamel, it was made of a translucent material with what looked like tiny electronic components inside. "Let me see that," Dan said, snatching it from my hand. The stuff inside looks like the computer board my dad showed me. I took it back and looked again through its cloudy surface. Computers are a lot bigger than this, I said definitively. Bob squinted at it. Weird. I bet my brother will know what it is. Should we go ask him? I suggested. Bob's brother, Ronnie, rotated the strange horn thing between his fingers as he looked at it under the desk lamp. Looks like it came from a robot or something. You guys are dumbasses. He tossed it back to me. Maybe it came from the alien that crashed down in Engine Valley, he added, making an eerie oohing sound. Huh? The three of us said in unison. Ronnie laughed. I guess you guys were still pissing your pants back then. A few years ago, the cops and everyone went out there when something crashed into the woods between Engine Valley Road and Scream Bridge. Word was, they found a busted-up flying saucer, but never found the alien. Back when that weirdo Wayne Warren was in school, I heard rumors that him and some buddy went out there to drink one night and found pieces of the UFO. I think that's around the time he started dressing up as the devil for Halloween. He's probably giving out UFO parts instead of candy. Cheap bastard. I think the whole thing is bullshit. Ronnie then left Bob's room. We all looked at the thing again. That's a cool story. We should go out there and check to see. Maybe this thing really did come from a spaceship, I suggested. Dan nodded. I've never seen anything like it. You guys are nuts, Bob said, eyeing us suspiciously. Anything good was usually forbidden. That was the trade-off of having parents that cared. I wasn't allowed to go down to the creek. Spin-the-bottle parties were off limits. I couldn't go in the yard of the kid who talked like a gin-filled sailor. Wasn't permitted to ride my bike to the Dairy Queen. And basically couldn't venture outside our small neighborhood area. As a result, I spent half my childhood down at the creek, or riding my bike out of bounds, and the other half conjuring reasonable excuses for why I was late. So a trek out to Engine Valley with my usual partner in crime, Dan, was not terribly out of the ordinary, but the potential for a dead alien was, and that's why this mission was going to happen regardless of any potential consequences. Bob, however, couldn't make it. He was grounded for getting caught with one of his dad's cigarettes. Looking back, I can't blame him for finding a way out. Engine Valley earned its name because of the motorcycle raceway built at its western head. Except for a few ill-maintained roads running through it, the valley was mostly dense Texas forest and flat lowlands that collected water, forming the closest thing to a swamp that central Texas could muster. If something had indeed crashed there, it was little wonder that collecting all the pieces had been difficult. But since the time of the alleged crash, which I later pinpointed to September 30th, 1972 by searching old newspapers, most of the water had been siphoned off to supplement a nearby cattle farm, making traversing the area possible without slogging through mud. Dan and I rode our bikes down the road past the old middle school and across Highway 10, where a few industrial buildings and a bar called the Fire Hose stood as stubborn holdouts against the notion of revitalization. These were the last bastions of civilization before Engine Valley took over. At the end of the industrial stretch, we turned right onto Engine Valley Road, a street that sloped downward at a gentle grade until it finally curved south and ran through the center of the valley itself. Few cars traveled here unless they were coming to dump something or cut across Highway 10, and Dan and I rode in the center of the pothole-ridden asphalt road as if we owned it. Along the roadside, lying in ditches, or along occasional dirt trails that webbed out from the street, we saw the rusted artifacts of prosperity scattered across the land like puncture wounds, old washing machines, bald tires, couch frames, and amputee dolls in their afterlife served as abodes for the black reptiles that hid underneath. We stopped pedaling to coast down the hill. "You remembered to bring the horn, right?" Dan panted. "Yeah." "You're going to be grounded forever if your mom finds out about this." I nodded feverishly. "What did you tell your mom we were doing?" "Going to the Dairy Queen with the arcade." "I hope your mom and my mom don't talk for some reason before we get back. You know, my mom is always calling around to see where I am. I just said I was going to the arcade. She doesn't want me going to Dairy Queen. She heard on TV about some guy who went into a Dairy Queen in Lubbock, whipped out his junk, and got arrested." Dan laughed. "Sounds like what Jimmy's cousin did at his birthday party. Was he the one that got kicked in the nuts by a girl when he did it?" "Yeah. He was bedridden for 2 weeks." "Awesome." We passed the curve and entered the long stretch of Engine Valley Road. After over half a mile, we reached the narrow road that led down to Scream Bridge. I'm sure that wasn't its original name, but that's what it was called. It came complete with one of those tragic stories of a suicidal, jilted lover. We had heard plenty about it, but hadn't yet had the occasion to venture out there. I guess it took a dead alien to make it worth the trip. Turning left, we pedaled up the side road that was nameless for lack of a street sign. As we ground our tires into the crumbling asphalt, the trees started growing thicker, leaning over the street, forming a canopy of leaves. They cast shadows across the road like a dark tunnel. Skeletal branches began poking through from the receding clumps of leaves, falling off in waves from the chilly autumn gusts. For a moment I thought of the forest in The Wizard of Oz, but the pleasant association quickly faded. I was confident that any monsters lurking in these brambly thickets would neither sing nor dance. In fact, they didn't even chirp or growl. Eerily quiet, this was even more unsettling. As we neared Scream Bridge, the asphalt turned to a sandy clay that made our bikes struggle, despite being the durable Huffy type with the plastic gas tanks affixed to the crossbars to mimic motorcycles. We decided to park the bikes out of sight and walk the remaining distance. The bridge itself was nothing special. A dirt road that ended in a ravine filled with sun-bleached beer cans and other less identifiable junk. After urinating off the bridge's edge, we headed south in the direction Ronnie had told us the UFO supposedly crashed. I checked my pocket for the pocket knife I had purchased with my allowance money before my last hunting trip with Dad. I was no stranger to the country, having been taken deer hunting countless times since I was old enough to walk. But despite my self-proclaimed expertise in wilderness exploration and determination to unravel the mystery buried in Engine Valley, my heart still pounded against my ribs. There was something about this place that seemed deceptive, even malevolent in a way I had never encountered in any of my previous rural explorations. Traversing the area, we started searching for any signs of a UFO crash. But the vegetation was thick, and I soon realized there would be little hope of finding anything if we didn't know the exact location of impact. Still, we pressed on, looking for charred trees or any other unusual markers. About 30 minutes later, Dan signaled me over to a thick clump of bushes where he had discovered something. "Look," he said, pointing through the branches at a dilapidated shack standing in a clearing about 25 yards away. It wasn't a UFO, but it was at least something other than trees and rocks. Dan looked visibly perplexed at the notion of who, or what, might call it home. "I wonder if anyone lives there." "I don't see any cars," I said. "I think I saw something move in the window," Dan said gravely. I peered at the grimy window pane. "I don't know how you could see anything. Look how dirty it is." "Yeah, maybe I imagined it. I think we should get out of here. Search back by the bridge." Don't worry about it, I responded, trying to rationalize the situation. If someone really lives there, they've got to be old and we can always outrun them. Dan nodded, but I could tell he wasn't fully on board with my decision. Let's go this W, I began as I heard sticks breaking behind us. I spun around. Standing just a few paces from us was a man. He looked old, but his disheveled appearance made exact age difficult to gauge. His hair was gray-brown and sprung from his head like weeds, framing a dirt-smudged face that hadn't seen a razor in days. A crooked smile revealed jagged teeth, protruding from the rotting brown mess inside his mouth. A pointed chin and bulging forehead made him look like a red version of the little gray aliens everyone sees. Sharp teeth jutted from shriveled lips, contrasting with the sunken eye sockets that held closed eyes. I could smell the putrid stench wafting through the room as if the monster was centuries old, saturated with the odor of death and decay for an eternity. We were revolted, though both Dan and I couldn't tear our eyes away from the interred object. Just like in the fairy tales. Only it ain't from no hell, it came from up there, Licky said, pointing to the sky. Been here longer than you or me can imagine, he cried out. Don't you like it? That's when I noticed the horn. The monster had a horn identical to the one I had been given. A jagged hole on the other side of its head made it clear it had once possessed two. Now I can finally wake it back up. I'll be the prince of the skies when it sees what old Licky done for it, the old man said, dribbling a streak of saliva on the creature's chest as he began reattaching the missing horn. The dog was barking outside, and we were still trapped between two teetering evils. Licky laughed as the final piece clicked into place. A faint humming began emanating from the casket as he stepped back. Take a good look, boys. You done brought old Nick back. The thing began to move, not mechanically like a robot as I had thought, but more like an organic being that had been asleep for a long time. It sat upright as its eyes began to open. Their black membranes looked like darkened mirrors as they focused on our pale faces. Its skin became softer and its lips curled down over its teeth. The monster smiled a smile more wicked than any devil, seeming to slither through my eyes, down my throat, and squeeze my pounding red heart like a python. But I resisted, and so did Dan. Breaking eye contact, we ran for the door as the monster leapt from the coffin. I had been used to deliver the horn back to the creature somehow. It seemed to explain my utter lack of sense as we had followed Licky inside. I had been possessed by something in the same way Wayne Warren had, dressing as the devil, perhaps unwittingly waiting for some adventurous child to take the horn from him, like the wind carries a seed to its final destination where it can take root and make seeds of its own. You look beautiful, Licky cried out. The devil responded by clawing a hand across him. Blood splattered the nude papered wall as the old man giggled and fell to the floor, beheaded despite having served it. Shit! I yelled as Dan and I burst through the door and tripped over the dog. We both fell to the ground, along with the dog, in a whirlwind of chaos and snapping teeth. I felt a few bites hit my arm, but as the devil slammed through the door, the dog yelped and ran into the woods. The monster laughed again and looked at us. It was one of those disconnected moments between reaction when the mind and body are trying to synchronize, when the true perception of time is lost. For a few endless seconds, the devil stood over us, and before we could stand to run, it turned and walked into the forest. It craned its neck to look at us one more time as it blended with nature and disappeared. Dan and I ran in the opposite direction, back toward the bikes. We said nothing as we crashed through branches and brambles that clawed at us with thorny fingers as if reluctant to let us leave. It wasn't until we were pedaling back up Engine Valley Road that I broke the silence and confronted the reality of what had happened. "Do you think that was the devil?" Dan, the horror etched on his face, shook his head. "If that was an alien, and there are more of them..." He started to cry. I could feel my own hands shaking on the handlebars. The reality of aliens and devils or something that was both was too much for my nascent mind to bear. "We can't tell anyone," I said aloud. "I never want to talk about this again." "We won't." "Never," was the last clear word I heard him utter before he deteriorated into a state of repetitive mumbling. If it was the devil, alien or not, and we were responsible for bringing him back to life, I wrestled with the thought. The thought that slowly leached the life from me over the years, like a patient snake subduing its prey. The same thought that caused the phone call I just received. I gently placed the phone receiver back on its cradle. It was Dan's sister. He had been found dead in his car this morning. He had been missing for several weeks. She asked me if I had any idea why he would drive out to a remote spot in Engine Valley and kill himself. I said I didn't know. I lived in a tiny studio apartment where the bedroom and kitchen were combined into one, with only a private bathroom. Not the kind of space you'd want a roommate in, right? Exactly. But Jimmy thought it was the perfect living condition for the two of us. He was happy, and as long as he was happy, he would stay. Jimmy appeared out of nowhere a few days ago. He woke me in the dead of night, placing a damp hand over my mouth and pinching my nose with the other. "Don't scream," he whispered. My eyes widened in panic as I struggled to breathe. If you live alone, you often wonder what you'd do if someone broke into your home. But in that moment, my mind was completely blank. I couldn't grab a weapon. I couldn't even move. He let go, and I gasped for air, but it wasn't enough to fill my lungs, turning into a panic more intense than anything else. "I'm just joking. You can scream if you want, but it won't mean anything. No one can hear you. Not anymore." He grinned, his bright white teeth the only thing visible in the darkness. "Are you always this quiet?" he continued, showing no real interest. "Let me turn on the lights so we can get to know each other." He jumped up, flicking the light switch, and that's when my fight response finally kicked in. I grabbed my blankets and threw them over him as I dashed for the door, fumbling with the lock while the stranger only laughed. He didn't even bother to approach or stop me. I finally unlocked the door, but no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't open. So I began pounding on it and screamed for help, then yelled fire, but nothing happened. I couldn't hear anything from the outside either. So eventually, I turned back to face the stranger. He was still standing by the light switch across the room, head slightly tilted. His eyes were the brightest green I'd ever seen on a human, almost glowing. He wore a baggy suit and had a headband with small red devil horns on his head. "Are you going to have a crisis now? Try everything to survive and all that nonsense?" When I remained silent, he simply nodded. "All right, let's fast forward a bit." He took a few steps towards the kitchen area of my studio and pulled out a large knife. "Now watch this." He approached, showing me the knife from every angle before flipping it and driving it into his own belly. He giggled as he withdrew it, leaving a red streak on his white shirt. "What?" I whispered. "Oh, look, you can talk." He continued by slicing straight across his throat, before dropping the knife on the ground and shrugging. See, can't be killed unless you get creative. Then he walked to the window and tried to open it. Stuck, hey, just like the door. Can't break them. He waved through the window and turned back to me. No one outside can see or hear us. Just you and me, buddy, for as long as I want. What are you? I blurted out. Oh, shut up. You sound like a character in a bad movie. I'm Jimmy. Just Jimmy. He left the knife on the ground and headed to my bed, sitting down and bouncing on the mattress a few times. Comfy. Are you going to stand there all night? Come over. He patted the mattress with his hand, motioning for me to come closer, but I was glued to the door, unable to move. The carefree expression on his face vanished, and his eyes darkened by 2 shades. I can't be killed, but you can, so come here and stay with me, Joe. I didn't even question how he knew my name. When I still didn't move, he got up and approached, a wicked smile spreading across his face. He grabbed my hand, and a sharp pain shot through my entire body. My hand started to go numb, like when you sit on your hand for too long. And when I looked down, I saw my skin shriveling and turning blue, life slowly draining from it. He let go, and it returned to normal. I gasped, and Jimmy chuckled. I can do that to your whole body, slowly drain you and hang you up to dry so I can make jerky out of you, or you can decide to be a good roommate and enjoy my company. I think we can be best friends if you just give me a chance. I nodded. All right. Yes. Let's be friends, I murmured. He returned to the bed with a spring in his step, and I reluctantly followed. We sat side by side, backs against the headboard. I had a TV right in front of the bed, so I asked if he wanted to watch something, which he thought was a great idea. So, I put on some cartoons, and Jimmy sat quietly, just staring straight ahead. When enough time had passed, I dared to speak again. Do you mind if I use the bathroom? What? Of course not. When nature calls, you answer, Joe. Just go ahead. I locked myself in the bathroom and just sat there, panting and wondering what to do. I spent so much time there that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. So eventually, I unlocked the door and stepped out. At first, there was no sign of Jimmy, and I almost let out a sigh of relief until I found him bent over on the kitchen floor. There were scissors and tape on the floor next to him, and it looked like he was working on some sort of collage, but he was hunched over his work so I couldn't see much. What are you doing there, Jimmy? I asked, my voice trembling. Crafting. You were in there so long, I thought you'd fallen in, he snorted. What are you making? This was ridiculous, the very definition of insanity, but what else could I do? There was no escape, no way to kill this creature, and at least for now, he seemed mostly friendly as long as I didn't refuse anything. So, I had to at least try to keep him that way, and it clearly worked best if I showed interest in some sort of friendship. I brought all the photos I took from old friends, and I thought it'd be nice if I made them into a big picture and then we can hang it on the wall, because now this place just looks like your home. But it's mine too. Yeah, great idea, I mumbled. Can I help? His eyes began to shine, and he smiled at me genuinely. That would be wonderful, Joe. Oh, I already like you. All right, sit down. As I did, he continued. So, I have these photos, and I'm taping them together to become one big photo, and then maybe if you have glitter, we can add that. He stood up, and began rummaging through my drawers, leaving me alone with the pile of photos. My stomach churned as I looked at all the photos, imagining different people slaughtered in the same horrific ways. He'd gouged their eyes from their sockets and slashed across them. Strips of hair were torn from their scalps, leaving patchy hair. Someone had sewn their mouths shut, and they all wore Jimmy's little devil horns. I flipped the photos over and saw the names of each person on the back: Jay, Juan, Jack, Jordan, and so on. I'd learned that he didn't like it when I seemed helpless or scared, so I decided to act as if this were completely normal. "All their names start with J," I said in the calmest voice I could muster. "Yeah, I like alliteration. Damn it, Joe. Where's your glitter?" Jarrett had tons of glitter. "I don't have any, but hey, Jimmy, were you planning to take a picture of me?" I asked carefully. "I don't have a camera. Sorry, buddy." "That's okay," I whispered. I slowly stood up and went into the bathroom to vomit until there was nothing left in my stomach. When I dared to step out, Jimmy had completed his project, and the gruesome collection from his victims was hung right beside my bed. "Looks great," I mumbled, and he beamed with pride. "I heard you puking, Joe. Are you sick?" I just shrugged because I didn't know what he wanted to hear. "I can make you some soup." "All right." I wasn't sure what concoction he brewed up, but I ate it all. It smelled like sweat and tasted like vinegar, but there were crunchy bits I tried not to think about. Jimmy joined me, and when he finished his bowl, he licked it clean with his tongue. A tongue covered in tiny suction cups, but I decided not to comment on it. I used every ounce of willpower not to vomit the soup back up. Some time passed, and I seemed okay, so at least he hadn't poisoned me. On the contrary, I felt quite good. Not mentally, of course, but physically, I felt okay. My panic had subsided, and I was fully conscious. Thankfully, the soup was the only meal Jimmy prepared. He left me in charge of other meals, and when we ran out of something, he'd disappear for a while and come back with food. However, I had to make a specific list. Otherwise, he'd return with rocks or strips of leather. I didn't want to know where he got them from. Jimmy could come and go as he pleased, but I was stuck there the whole time. During his absences, I searched for a way out, but so far, I hadn't found anything. I kept wondering if anyone missed me, my parents, or my friends. But no one tried to reach out to me. I wasn't sure if they hadn't noticed yet, or if they couldn't. I tried texting and calling, but nothing went through. I was truly trapped here, but as long as I kept my unwanted roommate happy, he didn't harm me. So, we played games, watched shows, and crafted. The crafting was always a bit gruesome, but I was getting used to it. We prepared decorations for Halloween because it was Jimmy's favorite day, and apparently the reason he always wore the fake devil horns. We had a pumpkin with real teeth, ghosts made from fabric that was centuries old, and dead bats he collected hanging from a string. I'm not sure what our Halloween celebration will look like, but hopefully it doesn't end with a picture of me. I never thought of myself as curious. Not any more than the next guy, anyway. It's just that I had what my mother used to call a morbid curiosity. I was the kid who climbed to the top of the oak tree in our backyard, just to see what was in the crow's nest. I was the kid who dug a hole 6 feet deep behind the garage because I was convinced there was a cave down there, and I wanted to see. My family wasn't dirt poor, but we weren't well off either. We were that disappearing middle class of America, the kind of people who worked hard and died with calluses on their hands and not a dime to their name. I started working at the riding stable when I was 14, mucking out stalls and feeding the horses. That didn't last long. I knew I had to work, that the family needed the money, so I took on odd jobs for the next few years, washing dishes, waiting tables, until I graduated high school. My dad was strict about college. He never went. No one in our family had, so we fought a lot about where I would go after graduation. I was shocked when, right after the ceremony, Dad drove me up to the state university and dropped me off. Turns out, he'd gone to high school with the dean, and they'd worked out a deal where I got a full ride, room and board, the whole 9 yards, as long as I kept my grades up and worked for the university. I never thought of myself as all that smart. In high school, I worked my tail off for mostly B's and a few C's. I wasn't interested in learning because learning was boring, but college was different. I mostly took general education stuff, math, English, history, science, but it was actually pretty interesting. No one cared if I showed up for class or not. It was on me to sink or swim, so I swam. In exchange for my education, I worked as a security guard and did some light maintenance. Maintenance was no big deal. I was always handy, and most fix-it jobs could be solved with WD-40, elbow grease, or both. But security was a different story. Security gave me superpowers. The job itself was pretty easy. I got a uniform, a badge, a flashlight, and my mom got me a little can of mace for my birthday. No, I didn't get a gun. The university didn't allow guns anyway. I mostly worked nights and weekends and pulled extra shifts during the long holiday breaks. My job was to make 2 rounds of the campus every night, checking the lab buildings, computer center, and the library. The rest of the time was mine. There were 2 other security guards, Jake and Al, but they worked different shifts than me. We had overlap nights on Wednesday evenings, where we'd all meet for an hour or so and go over any important events or changes. There may have been some beer involved in those meetings, but I wasn't old enough to drink, and you can't prove anything anyway. Jake mostly worked days, and Al worked split shifts and some nights during the week. Jake was a young guy, training to be on the local police force, so he took his job pretty seriously. I'm pretty sure Al mostly napped during his shift, on the other hand. Al was old, though, so he deserved a break. Remember that bit about superpowers? My first night on the job, Al handed me a giant key ring with what seemed like 1,000 keys on it. It weighed about 5 pounds and was chained to my belt with a heavy-duty metal clip. "Don't lose that key ring, kid," Al said. "You're holding the keys to the kingdom, and any door you can't open, you stay the hell away from." My guilty pleasure, the thing that kept me sane during those long, cold winter nights, was exploring. I made it a point, every night, to open one door I'd never opened before. I started in the new part of campus, where the library and computer center were, opening every room, every closet, making a mental map of where everything was. Some nights, I got to explore 2, maybe 3 rooms. Other nights, I'd only have time for some weird, out-of-the-way broom closet. My university was a pretty big campus, even though it only had 12 or 1,300 students. It had been built as a Methodist college back in 1896 and became a state property back in the 1930s. There were 3 main areas to the campus. Old Campus was where the administration offices and a few unfortunate classrooms were located. Unfortunate due to a lack of central heating and air conditioning, and the fact that the 3-story building had no elevator. The lab complex was a crumbling concrete block with tiny little windows that had been built in the 1970s, when buildings that looked like Soviet-era radiator grills were all the rage. The new library was rapidly losing its new sheen, having been built in the late 1990s, with all the red brick and glass uniqueness as everything else built in that era. Looking back on those early days, the days before it happened, I realize how stupid I was, how naive. I should have been thinking about winter. I should have been thinking about the solstice. By December of my sophomore year, I'd explored every nook and cranny of the new library. I'd opened every door, checked every closet, and had a pretty complete mental map of the whole building. It was, ultimately, pretty underwhelming. No buried treasure, no missing computer equipment stashed away in a forgotten closet. The most exciting thing I found was a small stash of old, musty porno magazines in a janitor's closet in the basement. Naughty cowgirls. Everyone has their secrets, I guess. December is a bleak time on a college campus. The post-final exam exodus leaves the campus eerily empty, the remaining staff looking lost and forlorn. The building stands silent, dark in the frigid winter wind. It snowed constantly, but not enough to close the campus. I made sure the sidewalks were clear and the entrances were salted, and tried to stay indoors as much as possible. Besides, I still had Old Campus to explore. The main building of Old Campus, Downing Hall, was a 4-story, vaguely V-shaped building. It had no elevator, just narrow, cramped stairwells, and was only exempted from ADA compliance due to its historical significance. It had no air conditioning, except for a handful of window units that were allowed to be installed on the back of the building so as not to detract from its historical beauty. Heat for the building came from a massive, ancient boiler in the basement. As far as I knew, Al was the only one who knew anything about the boiler, and he must have kept it in good shape, because I never heard any complaints about it. I spent the second week after final exams poking around the upper floors of Downing Hall. I didn't have as much time to explore each night, what with the snow requiring me to do more shoveling than usual, but I was making steady progress. I discovered a small attic room in the west wing that must have been an old dean's office, with a beautiful antique desk and wardrobe. I'd checked them both, thinking I might find something historic to give to the current dean, but the wardrobe was empty, save for a moth-eaten wool shawl, and the desk drawer held only a few old newspapers and some tax forms from the 1950s. Downstairs, on the 4th floor of the building, I found 24 small, empty classrooms. Being the handyman I was, I checked the windows for loose panes, water damage, or signs of vermin. I was prepared to see mouse droppings, or at least some roaches, but I found nothing. The 2nd and 3rd floors were similar, except the rooms on the back of the building had window units and were thus actively used for classes when school was in session. The main floor was the administrative area, including the dean's office. I figured it wouldn't be cool to be caught poking around the boss's office or the accounting office, so I mostly gave those rooms a wide berth. I made my way to the stairwell leading down to the basement, used my superhero key ring to unlock the heavy door, and made my way down. The basement of Downing Hall was different from the basement of the new library. First off, it was a lot more cramped. The hallways were narrow, the ceilings low, with doors leading off at regular intervals on either side. I checked each room, one by one, flipping the old-fashioned 2-button switch to on, shining my flashlight into the dark corners. I'd brought a couple of packs of spare light bulbs, the newfangled CFC kind, in my bag, figuring I'd replace any burned-out bulbs and save the environment while I was at it. The small rooms mostly held junk, spare chairs, filing cabinets full of paperwork from 40, 50 years ago, old Christmas decorations, etc., illuminated by bare, hanging bulbs. I wasn't an imaginative guy. I figured I was reasonably intelligent. I was making straight A's in my college courses after all. It never occurred to me to be scared. I never once thought, I'm all alone, in a creepy old basement. This was my place, my job, my hobby, and it all seemed perfectly normal. By the night of December 20th, I'd made my way to the boiler room. The boiler itself was a massive hulk of iron and steel, with 1,000,000 rivets, pipes, and gauges. The room was stiflingly hot and just as loud. It was, however, very neat and clean. Al kept it that way because, as he put it, a clean boiler will let you sleep at night. The boiler had been converted from coal to gas at some point, but coal dust still stained the walls of the room, and the old coal chute was still visible in one corner. I wasn't planning on paying much attention to the boiler room. I'd been in there a dozen times already, and there wasn't much to see, just a workbench and the boiler itself, until I noticed a small door on the far side to the left of the boiler. That's weird, I thought to myself. I'd never noticed that door before, but then I realized I'd never been standing in that particular spot, next to the workbench, and never really looked. The door was smaller than a normal door, maybe 5 feet tall, and painted the same dull brownish gray as the walls, and made of metal, like the other doors in the basement. I walked over to the door and tried the handle. I think sometimes the body knows when something is wrong. Have you ever had the feeling that you're being watched? When you know you're completely alone and no one can see you, but you feel eyes on you? Have you ever turned left instead of right because you had a gut feeling that you shouldn't go right today? Not me, though. When I touched that doorknob, I didn't feel anything unusual. I didn't get a headache. My hair didn't stand on end, and I didn't hear any voices in my head telling me, "Don't do it." The doorknob turned, but the door didn't open. I looked closer and saw a small keyhole. I checked my magic key ring and found 3 that might fit. The first 2 didn't work, and the third one unlocked the door, because of course it did. Of course it did. The hinges groaned as if they hadn't been used in a very long time, like decades. The handyman part of my brain made a note of that. WD-40, I muttered. I pulled the door open and stepped through into another short, narrow hallway. The light switch worked, and the single light bulb exploded with a loud pop. Damn it. That time my hair stood on end. I flicked on my flashlight and quickly replaced the hallway bulb with a new one from my bag. I looked around and saw that this hallway was narrow and straight and ended after about 10 feet at another door. That door opened easily, leading to another set of stairs. "What the hell?" I exclaimed. No one had ever mentioned a sub-basement to this building. My hair was still standing on end. I reassured myself it was just the stress from the blown light bulb and walked over to the stairs. It was a standard staircase, looking pretty much identical to the other staircases in the building. I started down the stairs and came to another door. I pushed it open and saw another long, narrow hallway with doors leading off at regular intervals on either side. The first door on my left was unlocked and opened easily enough, revealing a storage closet. There were a bunch of books from the late 1960s, a couple of desks, and a rotting mop in a bucket. The door opposite was unlocked, but didn't open as easily. I pulled harder on the door and found a larger room that looked like it had once been used as a classroom. There were desks, a blackboard, and anatomical charts and posters on the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in a very long time. Why would anyone put a classroom down here? I muttered to myself. How could they even convince students to come down here in the first place? It occurs to me now that I must have thought I had somehow discovered a secret passageway into the other wing of the V-shaped Downing Hall. Maybe this is where they held the old-timey science classes before the lab complex was built. I moved on to the next two rooms. Both were classrooms, abandoned, dusty, and mostly empty. The next two after that, and the next two after that, were the same. I saw a total of 12 abandoned classrooms in that hallway, and a small break room with a single, forlorn coffee pot. I also found 2 small restrooms. I didn't spend much time checking those, as the lights didn't work, and I wasn't interested in replacing those bulbs. I was starting to get a little creeped out. I was in a weird part of campus, and I was working alone that night. Deep down, I couldn't justify the existence, the waste, of an entire floor full of unused classrooms. When I got to the end of that hallway, I came to another steel door. I opened it and saw another set of stairs. I fully expected these stairs to go up to connect with one of the other main stairwells in Downing Hall. But the stairs only went down. I remember that's when I started to get scared. No way. There's no way these stairs go down. How could anyone get down here? Down here. Down here. Down here. The stairs echoed back at me. I should have checked the time. I should have been concerned about finishing my rounds. I should have been hungry and wanted to get some dinner. I should have run. I started down the stairs. These stairs had no lights and seemed older, far more worn than any I'd encountered in the building. They were also longer, much longer. After a few minutes of descending, I began counting the steps, each 12 marked by a small landing, a turn, and then another dizzying descent. Down. After 10 of these landings, I came to another door. This one too stood unlocked, swinging open with a groan that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I felt along the left wall, searching for a light switch, but found only smooth, cold stone. The right offered no solace either. My flashlight beam danced across the emptiness, revealing nothing. Nothing ahead, nothing to the sides, nothing above. I snapped my fingers, listening for the echo, unsure if it ever came. A chilling realization crept over me. The room I'd stumbled into was impossibly vast, a cavernous expanse unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I took an instinctive step back, towards the doorway and the faintest glimmer of light. "This room can't be here," I whispered, my voice a thin tremor in the suffocating silence. The thought of turning back, of retracing my steps, took root in my mind. But another, more insidious thought took hold, a need to know, to see what secrets this abyss held. I took a tentative step forward, and then another, until I was walking with a strange determination into the heart of the room. I kept a steady pace, counting my steps, my flashlight beam a fragile beacon in the impenetrable darkness. Every few yards I'd glance back, using the sliver of light from the open doorway as a reference point. I walked for what felt like an eternity, 100 paces, 200, 300, until finally, in the distance, I saw a faint light. The light grew steadily brighter, larger, as I walked towards it. Another 100 paces, and another, until finally I could make out a single, bare bulb, casting a sickly yellow glow near a doorway. This door was unlike any I'd seen before, immense, At least 14 feet high and half as wide, its surface was a monstrous slab of black metal, held together by rivets the size of my fist and set on gigantic hinges. Etched deep into the metal were strange arcane symbols I couldn't decipher. Every surface was covered in these glyphs, or bizarre diagrams of sprawling circular lines. In the center of the door was a large iron wheel lock, and at its center, a tiny keyhole. Above the keyhole was a symbol, encased in 3 concentric circles. I glanced back, and the light from the stairwell was gone. There was nothing but the oppressive darkness, pressing in on me from all sides. Holding my keychain up to the dim light, I flipped through the keys. Of course, there was a small, ancient-looking key that seemed like it might fit. I slipped it into the lock and turned. There was a grinding, metallic clang, and a sound from within the door like gravel shifting, or teeth gnashing. Pulling the key free, I gripped the spokes of the wheel lock, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, sweat stinging my eyes. I turned the spokes to the left, counterclockwise. Clockwise was bad luck, some primal instinct whispered, and kept turning, until the wheel locked with a resounding thud. Another clang and crack echoed through the chamber, and then silence. The darkness behind me no longer felt empty. In fact, it felt crowded, as if I had an audience, their unseen eyes boring into my back. I stepped back from the door, swinging my flashlight beam around. Still nothing. Just the bare, dry earth floor. Turning back to the door, I gripped the 2 large handles and pulled. Nothing. I pulled harder, putting all my weight into it, and at the last moment, as my strength gave out, there was another deafening crack, and the door groaned open, releasing a gust of stale, fetid air. The stench was overpowering, a humid, musky odor. I was suddenly reminded of being a child when my mother had taken me to the zoo, and the reeking, overpowering smell of the big cat house where the lions were kept. The thought of lions rooted me to the spot as I cautiously shone my flashlight beam into the dark maw of the open doorway. I saw a short hallway leading into a small, cramped room. I saw a filthy, rusting metal chair. I saw bones, small, delicate bones. I saw, or felt, or smelled a shape so utterly black it seemed to draw the light from my flashlight beam. I saw a shape so black it rushed towards me, ran towards me, filling the hallway, shrieking and laughing maniacally and speaking in a voice that sounded like an avalanche. I remember the fangs and the words that shattered my bones to splintered glass. I remember the feathers and a hand with too many fingers, adorned with something I can't bring myself to describe. And the stench, the overpowering stench of something caged for far too long. I remember the wings. I don't know how long I wandered in the dark, alone beneath hundreds of feet of stone. There was no light, no way to judge the passage of time. My flashlight batteries died, and then my cell phone, and then even the tiny luminescent dots on my cheap wristwatch went dark. Something was wrong with my right leg. It hurt terribly, but I couldn't see to know why. I could still hear my audience, there, in that cavernous room. I yelled at them. I felt one of them touch my face, and I threw my flashlight at it. The flashlight bounced and clattered and came to rest, somewhere that wasn't where I was. Something laughed then. I screamed and shouted, but didn't throw anything else. I found the exit after hours or days of crawling. There were no lights on the stairs. After years of climbing, I crawled into that first forgotten hallway. I cut my fingers on the shards of the light bulbs I had stuffed in my pockets. I crawled down the hall and to the next set of stairs. I pulled myself up the stairs and finally out into the boiler room. By the time I stumbled out of Downing Hall, 2 days after I'd gone in, it was dawn, and the police were everywhere. 5 people had been found dead in and around the campus. All had been savagely, brutally murdered, their bodies torn open, their organs missing. Bite marks suggested some sort of wild animal, but the crime scenes, the positioning of the bodies, also suggested intelligence. There was also the writing, carved into the flesh while the victims were still alive. The police wouldn't tell me what the writing said. They wouldn't talk to me much either. Not after. When they saw me stumble into the morning light, covered in blood, they assumed I was responsible. They quickly revised their assumptions when the doctors pointed out the broken bones, the dehydration, the concussion, and the shock. They asked me a lot of questions, and I answered them as best I could. I told them about the door in the boiler room. They couldn't find it. They just showed me the smooth, blank wall where I had crawled out, delirious and broken. My tracks stopped at that wall. 2 of them tried to break through the wall there, but they just found old brick and older earth behind it. The police wanted to know where the long black feathers clinging to my clothes, stiff with dried blood, had come from. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The police, the doctors, no one wanted to look at me for very long. The scars on my face, the deep, ugly glyphs, weren't something most people wanted to see. I had been marked. Whatever I had released, whatever had killed and eaten 5 people, and a week later 6 more, had marked me as its own. A bone-chilling tale, wouldn't you say? If you enjoyed this descent into darkness, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are many more horrors waiting to be unearthed, and you won't want to miss a single terrifying moment. Good night.